So thanks so much for joining us. And now that you can see the screen, you may also see those videos. And again, I remind you that there's some icons that will allow you, if you put your cursor over the video, that you can minimize the video so it doesn't block the screen. We remind you again that the title of our session comes from the idea that this is an adventure with God, that being part of the restoration is an adventure that we have undertaken, and together in a spirit of adventure and openness, we look towards the future. The idea for this session was conceived and nurtured by Carrie, and again, I encourage you, if you found this to be useful, that you communicate that to Carrie. Some of this idea came from his experience of observing what happened in the Fort Myers, Florida congregation, and so we thank them, especially Gary Villeneuve, for some of their materials. I have also borrowed liberally from Tony and Charmaine, and also from John Hamer. Again, we've all seen the bad news. We've seen what's happening in Christian churches in the Western world and how it mirrors and confirms our own experience as we look around at our congregations and we think about the transition that has happened in the church that we grew up in over our lifetime, which may be 30, 40, 50, or even 70 years. And we've seen the statistics that show this inexorable trend that is dramatically changing the experience in our culture as we move from this idea of a modern era into the postmodern era. And again, there are many caveats about definitions and how vague all of this is. But certainly organizations of every kind, and in particular churches, are finding themselves suddenly having to navigate this corner that we're called here postmodern corner, that illustrates how Community of Christ and all churches are trying to figure out how do we make it around this corner and get to this place that we show here at the bottom, this fuzzy unknown place called Church 3.0. And it's a scary transition. And we've used this photo to demonstrate that. This idea to represent where we are and what it feels like as we go through this transition. And it can be a scary time for all of us. And so we ask ourselves, given all of that, given where we've been and the things that we've discussed together, it seems clear that the default future, if we just let current trends have their way with us, the default future certainly looks scary. And last time we asked the question, can we, though, see a preferred future? One that we can choose to make happen, that we can choose to implement, and that we can choose to live together as a church. I believe that that's what we've been called to do as a prophetic people. And certainly as we explore the counsel that has been given to the church in the last 20 years, we see strongly the call to respond to the changes in the world. Certainly we do have new challenges, and the world will require new forms of ministry and requires new response from us as a church. And so we've talked about how over the last 50 to 60 years, we as a church have been through a transition. We have gone through a process from being RLDS into being Community of Christ. And we talked about all the different facets of that. And I suggest that perhaps it's even better illustrated by one of my favorite artists, called David Hayward, who also goes by the name of the Naked Pastor, and is a Canadian who lives outside of St. John, New Brunswick. You can find him on Facebook and on the internet. And his drawings or his cartoons, however you want to describe them, can summarize some things very succinctly. And he shows here how often the church has tried to contain God. We try to fit God into our understanding and our concept of the church. But in fact, God is so much bigger than just the church. Whatever church it is, God is so much bigger and cannot be contained anywhere inside the church. And I'd suggest that that is a very succinct way to understand that transition that we made when we went from trying to contain God in our narrative of a one true church to the narrative that we have today that says that we take our place amongst all the churches who would claim the name of Christ. And so we've looked through how even as our tradition has gone through this transition, which in historical time frames is pretty amazing, to have gone through this dramatic a change really in our own lifetime. And even though we identified how many of the changes that we made and how many of them then align with the postmoderns, we realize that we still, that by itself does not mean that we have become a church that is going to make sense or is going to appeal to a postmodern world. And so I suggested that in fact, the transition that we've already made is but the beginning. That's not the end of our transformation that we've called here Restoration 3.0. But really, that was the preparation. That was the foundation that brings us to the challenge that we have ahead of us. That it was only in making that transformation that we've done so far are we now poised, in fact, to become the church that can live on in the future, that we've called here Church 3.0, even though we don't understand what it looks like yet. We believe that we have gone through this process in order to be positioned to take advantage of that. And so let's take a look again at what are those challenges in front of us. If we look at our postmodern world that we've begun to see some of the elements as we look at them, we can identify that there's at least three important components that we want to look at. Certainly one of them is our existing congregations. This is who we are. This is what the church is. Headquarters is not going to just wave some magic wand and put out some new program or some new whatever, and it's going to change who we are. We as congregations, we as members, we are the grassroots church that will have to change, and that in changing and transitioning, we will transform the church into whatever it's going to be in that postmodern world. And so the first question that we need to ask is, how do we continue as congregations? How do we continue to best live out Christ's mission in our congregations today? Just because we see that the world is changing, just because we understand that we don't have all the answers for the future, doesn't mean that we stop caring and living our discipleship today in our congregations and in our personal lives. And that will continue for some time, certainly until most of us, as long as most of us are part of the church, for another 20, 25, 35 years, we will have an understanding of a church and perhaps an expression of a church that continues to meet our needs. And so we need to ask ourselves, how best can we as congregations continue to live out that mission? If we think about the world that we grew up in, we think about how we looked at it through modern eyes, we saw churches as being very much just a visible part of the community and the social landscape that we grew up in. And so when we did activities like had potlucks and games nights and bowling nights and invited friends to come to reunion retreats, we naturally connected to other people, to other churched people, to other people who also saw churches as part of the social landscape and part of the community. And so all of us know of people who were in that category that we sometimes referred to as friends of the church, who were part of our community and the relationships that we formed. And there were many others who were part of those activities who never chose to become officially part of our church community. And yet many did. And if we took the time, many of us could share testimonies of the relationships that were built and the connections that were made, and of the people who are simply loved into the church by being part of that sharing, connected community. But when we look through postmodern eyes, churches are either invisible, or because of all the problems that we talked about in the last couple of sessions, churches are actively avoided. And they are not seen as being part of the community and the social landscape. And so the second big challenge that we have is to ask the question, how can we then connect with postmoderns the way that we did in our churches when we were growing up? How do we create communities and relationships that will meet their social and spiritual and their wholeness and wellness needs that I've described here as being part of Shalom? How can we create a network and a community of relationships that exists then in that postmodern world? And out of those communities and those relationships, even though we still don't know exactly what that Church 3.0 will look like, we can still be certain that God will be calling us and be calling other people. How will they hear and respond to that call? And so we ask, what new expressions of being the church are going to be the ones that will call to those people in a postmodern world, who we're in community with, who we are in relationships with? What will be those expressions of church that will call to them, that will make them want to say, I want to be part of this, where they will engage in the discipleship of living mission? And how are we going to help people hear and respond to that call? I'd suggest that those are the three key elements, that questions that we need to answer as we begin this process. Roughly a third of all Canadians, maybe as many as 11 million according to the research, are people who are looking for some kind of community. Now, we can represent that in a couple of different ways. One way is by asking, who are these people? And we've already talked about them in many of the discussions that we've already had in the previous session. We have the unchurched people. That's that group that's maybe as high as 30%, who are the nones, who answer the question and say, we have no religious affiliation. They're the faith refugees. These are the people who have a background in a Christian tradition. Here we refer to them euphemistically as legacy members, meaning many of the people who were part of our own tradition and who no longer are engaged. There are also people from other traditions that we've referred to as the duns, the people who couldn't find what they needed. They couldn't find a spiritual community, couldn't find a spiritual home that spoke to their needs, and who now are not engaged at all. And certainly our own experience with Latter-day Seekers would fall into this category. We know that there's a great many postmoderns who would describe themselves as being spiritual but not religious. These are the people who are spiritually aware. They're aware that they want to be whole people, that they want to include some element of spirituality in their well-being, but are searching for a place where they can express that and share that. And then there's a group of people who we can describe with several different titles. Here we've just called them those that want to make a difference, the humanists, the people who would also be explicitly non-religious, and that might include those who describe themselves as agnostics or atheists. And yet they're still looking for community of people who share their desire to make a difference in the world. So that's one way of looking at all of those people out there. Another way of looking at it is to look at it in terms of what they are looking for. And so we can also kind of slice this population by saying, what are they looking for? And certainly all of them are looking to belong. The largest group is just people who, in a world where, despite the fact that technology allows us to be connected to everyone, they look around in their life and realize that they really are connected to no one. And they long to form meaningful connection with people, to have meaningful discussions, to have experiences that go beyond the shallowness of simply talking to people on social media or in a work setting. Then there are the group who are the spiritual explorers, those who are explicitly saying, I want to develop a spiritual presence in my life. And I'd like to find a community of others who value and share being on that spiritual journey together. And there are also the community of those who are Christian in their outlook, who have experience and are looking for a spiritual home and are looking for a place that will help allow them and enable them to express their discipleship in a way that has meaning and makes sense to them. So if we take a look at those two different ways of looking at them, we say, well, how do they match up? Well, everyone is looking to belong. Everyone is looking to be connected to other people, to like-minded people who share an outlook, who share concerns, who share a desire to explore how they can be part of a society that cares and can make a difference. Some, as we said, will also want to explore their spirituality, and this is particularly true for those who are faith refugees or those who describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. And there may well be others in the other categories who simply haven't looked at their lives, hadn't had experience that allows them to see themselves as spiritual beings who might also respond in some way to that opportunity. Similarly, there are those who may find what they're looking for and find ways to reconnect with their Christian identity that already exists. And so one way to look at the challenge or the opportunity, we can look at it in both ways, is to say, how can we put together some programs? How can we put together some outreach? How can we do mission in a way that brings people into community, that brings them into relationship with each other and with us as a faith community? And even if we go no farther than this, this is mission. We are a church that promotes communities. We are a church that invites people into community with us, with each other, and invites people to be part of mission in the form of abolishing poverty or peace and justice or spiritual formation or continuing education. There are many ways that we can invite people to be part of a community and to be in relationship with us and to be about missional activities, even if we never refer to it in classical Church 2.0 terms of being a church. It's still about the mission. It's still about inviting people to be part of a community and building relationships first. And there is much opportunity and much we can do as we invite people into all of these missional areas. But we also recognize that there is the opportunity for many, for some who will ask the question, why do you do this? And in exploring our testimonies, they may also seek to hear the call, sense the call in their lives to be part of an organization that is creating these connections and these relationships, that is working for peace and justice, that is working to abolish poverty, that is looking to develop disciples. And in this way, it creates opportunity for us that can lead to those new expressions of the church that I believe will be essential as we understand what Church 3.0 might look like in a postmodern world. And so as a church, as we experience this uncertainty, as we go through this corner, as we skid a little bit here and there's dust flying and there's all these experiments and we're not sure what's going on, as we experience that uncertainty, here in Canada, leadership has already developed a strategy of how we can approach and deal with some of that certainty. And it gives us an opportunity not to say we have all the answers, but simply to say, here's a framework. And I'm really hoping that all of us by now are very familiar with the 3-third strategy that describes the framework for our response in terms of congregations and mission, creating connections, and new expressions. And I don't want to dwell too much on these, but simply to point out that the question of congregations and mission is really asking the question that we started with. of how do we continue to best live out Christ's mission in our congregations today. That's where we are. That's where we live. That's where we serve. And that's where we will transform the church as we respond to the opportunity in this new world. This first part of the strategy is absolutely crucial. And we're going to look at some of the other questions that we might want to ask ourselves as we go through that process. How do existing congregations adapt and respond to the changes that we see in the world around us? The initiative called Creating Connection is absolutely asking that question. How can we connect with postmoderns and communities that offer relationship, that offer connection with others, like-minded people that can meet social and spiritual and shalom needs to be whole, well-being persons? Similarly, our question of what new expressions of the church need to emerge in order for us to enable people to see themselves as disciples, to hear the call, is exactly the question that we asked of how do we find ways. We know that God is going to continue to reach out and to call people. How do we help others? How do we help postmoderns? How do we help people in whom we have community and relationship to hear that call, to see themselves as disciples and see themselves as people who want to respond? We don't know what those new expressions will be or may emerge. And I would suggest that we will learn most about those new expressions as we in fact connect with others who will help us explore and define what a meaningful response will look like for them and in their lives. So out of that strategy, hopefully you have already seen these kinds of materials that point out how creating connections, which is the place where most work has been done and where most progress has been made, with 20-some connection groups, have made inroads and have already begun the experimenting process. What we see today is not what was envisioned when the strategy was first developed in 2016, but it already represents at least 3 years of experience and changing and modifying and adapting and a lot of hard work that will continue as we try to find ways that we can engage in communities. But this is a strategy of the new strategies. This is the one that is most developed and most far along in the path. And hopefully this isn't a surprise to anyone, because you hopefully have already seen these materials. The eyes of the church are on Canada. Those of us who had the opportunity to be at World Conference were very aware that leadership and people in the aisles and people we talk to are very aware that things are happening in Canada, that we are doing experiments, that we are finding things that work, we're finding out things that don't work. And so the larger church is seeing how they can learn from our experience. And so our Apostle Art Smith had an article in the March-April Herald that talked about this process. and talked about the focus on becoming a community that is trying to birth and multiply those communities of disciples. We know that the church will look different from what we're used to, and the journey will be surprising. I hope that's not too much of an understatement. But certainly we can know that we're on the front edge of those in the church who are exploring and, and pioneering how we respond as a church, as mission centers, as congregations. The Creating Connection initiative capitalizes on a primary initiative of invitation. And it simply says, how do we create safe spaces that use inclusive language and that avoid church talk, the jargon that most postmoderns simply don't understand? How do we draw the circle wide? How do we invite seekers to come into safe, inclusive spaces that can share mission and community in a way that's compelling and different than what they experience in their everyday life? And so you've seen probably many of these examples of how congregations and individuals throughout the mission center are creating these communities. Some of it is through coffee and conversation. Some of it is through meaningful discussions. Some of it is through spiritual practices. Some of it is through education and learning, and any other number of activities that can bring people together. We're not here to focus specifically on those particular activities, but there's lots of material available if you as an individual or you as a congregation want to begin to understand how you can be part of this process. They make great use of social media and other kinds of technology that allows us to get it, to expand the reach, to draw that circle wide. And it has been successful. As we heard at Mission Conference, over that period since we began this process, more than 1,000 people have come in contact with some activity that is part of the expression of Community of Christ. How much larger can we make that community? How many other ways can we find that we can be in relationship and in community with those in the world? Creating Connection has already begun to expand beyond just the local meetups, beyond the weekly or monthly connection groups, into connection retreats, that when you look at them, they sure look a lot like some of our experience of reunions and retreats and youth camps. And we're beginning to ask, how can we harness the proven power and the compelling togetherness that our experience as a church in decades and decades of reunions and camping to bring people together so that they see themselves as part of a larger community than just their local weekly meeting. Perhaps out of these kinds of activities will come some other new expressions of church that will be compelling and appealing to these many people. I believe they've had 3 or 4 of these retreats and have had significant experiences, and people have responded and indicated how important these have been in their life and how meaningful they have been as a form of providing ministry and connection and relationship. How many other ways can we expand on what we've already got? But I want now to come back full circle to the first part of our strategy, to our congregations. Those congregations where we live and work and provide ministry. President Vesey, in his Time to Act in 2017, was very clear in the counsel that he offered that the status quo is not going to be enough. That simply persisting in doing what we're doing will not take us into the future that we see unfolding in front of us. And so as congregations, we all are faced with grappling with this question of how can we respond? We need to understand that all of our congregations are vulnerable. In Canada, 50% of the congregations have closed since 2000. And all of the congregations are and continue to be vulnerable because of the very trends that we talked about. The declining members, those who are there are getting older, have less energy, fewer leaders, less assets, lower contributions, all of those familiar refrains that we've already talked about. Those continue day after day, week after week, and the clock just keeps ticking. The time that we have to begin to make changes that can make a difference in the life of our congregation and our members continues to evolve. And so as congregations, we too can look at three possible ways that we might respond. The first one, for some congregations, they simply may not be paying attention, or they may not have leadership that's willing to tackle the change. They may not have the energy or the desire to do any change or to have intentionality. For other congregations, they may intentionally choose to continue on the path that they're on, to continue being a church that looks after the needs of its members, that continues to offer pastoral ministry. And another way to say it is to continue being the best possible Church 2.0 congregation. And they may intentionally choose that approach, understanding fully the consequences, understanding that this is essentially a form of palliative approach to church, that understands that this is not the long-term solution, but will take advantage of the people and the resources and the assets that they have to continue to do good things as a congregation until the lack of members or the contributions at some point in the future may limit their options. And lastly, some congregations will choose to focus on intentional invitation and connection with people who are outside of the current attendees. What we most need to understand as a church is that all of these responses are okay. We cannot demand of some congregations' responses that they are incapable or unwilling to give. Each congregation, each member, us as a mission center, are all at different places on that transition. There's no judgment. Each congregation will own and be able to make its own response and to choose. Now, of course, I gave 3 options, but those are just some of the highlights. There are many, many different ways that congregations can respond that will be a combination or something completely different. But all of them are okay. Some need to respond to the call and will feel the need to push, to encourage, to cajole, to call and prepare their congregation, to be engaged directly in missional activities, to be engaged in creating those communities and those relationships with people, to be saying, how can we be part of the creating connections? How can we begin to develop a new response, to develop a new kind of church? And that's fabulous. And some will remain viable by continuing to focus on their pastoral mission, by mentoring others who are engaged in the missional activities. Perhaps congregations will find a way to say, we have assets, we have resources. We don't have the energy or the people or the leadership to do those things ourselves. But we will be cheerleaders, we will be mentors, and we will financially support those who do respond. And in that way, we'll continue to support the mission of the church. And there are some congregations that just simply need to let go. There are going to be congregations who need the equivalent of superannuation, who simply need to be honored and celebrated and thanked for their years and their decades of service that has been faithful and meaningful and useful in many lives. And we need to celebrate that. Yes, we can grieve, but we also need to celebrate and then choose how we can go forward and how we can help those who are part of those congregations to find another home that will work for them. All of those responses are okay. All of those responses are going to happen in our congregations. And so we shouldn't be surprised by them. We shouldn't be shocked. We shouldn't be disappointed. They are going to happen. We have already seen these responses happening in the life of some congregations, and they are certainly going to happen in the next decade or two as we move forward. So given where we are, given what we have as assets and resources, given what we know about the world that we see, the last time we asked the question, what do we need to do and what do we need to not do? Now, when I went back and looked at this, saying what do we need to do makes it sound like we actually know what the answers are. And I suggest to you that more accurately, we should be asking ourselves, what do we need to explore? What do we need to try? What do we need to take out our congregational wallet and say, let's put some dollars into this. Let's see what happens. Let's see if we try something new. The biggest issue for most of our congregations, certainly here in CEM and in the church in North America, the biggest issue for almost every congregation is going to be building. And the fundamental question that we need to ask is, are we going to be facilitators? Or are we going to be facility managers? And we can get into a whole bunch of questions about parsing what that actually means. But I hope you get the idea. It's a question of asking, what's wagging what here? Is the mission dog wagging the property tail? Is our mission determining what building and what assets and what facility we have and how we use it? Or is the mission that we undertake being wagged by the fact that we already happen to have this building? We already have this property. And therefore, our mission is being determined by, is being limited by, is being controlled by the property or the building that we have. This, I suggest, is a fundamental question that every congregation is going to need to wrestle with and to ask that question. What's wagging what? And sometimes we can tell ourselves some pretty amazing things. But we might want to ask, what would an outsider say is happening in our congregation if they looked at our budget? If they looked at where we as a congregation spend our money, what would they say is the most important thing that happens in that congregation? Would they see mission? Or would they see keeping the lights on? Those are some fundamental questions that we each need to ask as we consider how our congregation and our community is going to respond. In the modern era, when we grew up, when our churches were almost all built, a building was mission. In a world of churched people, where to create a viable alternative to say, we are a real church, we built buildings. The question today that we need to ask is that still true? Another way of asking that question is to ask, how much mission money, how much asset that is to be used in mission is in today's buildings? Does it properly reflect how many people are driving that mission that happens in each of our facilities? Are there other places that if we were to suddenly drop out of the sky into the communities where we live and where we worship, and we had the money that is tied up in today's buildings, we need to ask ourselves, would we spend that money to create the facility that we have today? These are tough choices. These are the kinds of questions that hopefully we ask as we intentionally ask, how are we going to respond as we go through this transition? And part of that discussion about our building is to say, what fits who we are today? Not who we were 50, 60 years ago, but who we are today Does the space that we have fit our congregation's size and our needs? Does it fit our mission? Or would a space that looks somewhat different serve us better? I suggest that those three questions about facilities and buildings are some that every congregation needs and wants to go through as they think about their response and how we're going to approach this transition. The other part of our congregation is about how can we create community. We like to think of ourselves as being a welcoming and inviting and an open church. And yet sometimes it's valuable for us to ask the question, and perhaps to ask some others who have come to our congregation, to ask, do we really do that? Does what we say actually reflected in how we behave? And again, the Naked Pastor highlights the challenges that we sometimes have. We say that we welcome people, but then we don't make it easy. And so another question for every congregation to struggle with is to say, are there things that we need to change in order that we become truly inclusive? Inclusive in all the different variants of the other who may come to our congregation. Whether it be a question of whether we're inviting to people of different ethnicities, whether we're inviting to people who have physical challenges, whether we're inviting and inclusive to people who have different sexual orientations or gender identification. Are we really who we want to be? And how can we explore that? Who can we ask who can help us understand their experience as they came into our community? We as a church have lots of stuff. We bring lots of baggage to this journey as we go flying around this corner, trying to get around postmodern corner. We need to ask ourselves the question, what really matters? What are the things that are fundamental to who we are? And what are the things that are simply the traditions that we have, the way it's always been? This is the question that Mary raised last time as we look at, are we going to need changes to our theology? Are we okay with that? What about how we see priesthood and sacraments and other things that we believe? We're not saying that we should throw them all out. We're not saying that they're all up for grabs or that they're all could be modified by taking a vote at a business meeting. That's not at all what we're suggesting here. But we as a church do need to ask what things really matter. What are the things that actually are part of our identity, as opposed to simply being what we've always done? Some of those things that we may need to question would come under the postmodern view of truths that are no longer universal. Many of us would recognize many of these issues. And our congregations and our mission centers and we of a church have struggled over some of these. Issues of cohabitation, whether that's exclusive of people being eligible for priesthood. We as a church has put out a statement about the use of alcohol. Certainly, for many of the postmoderns that I know, including many of our children, they have looked at it and said, the church has been cherry picking sins. We say lots about some things, such as alcohol, but we don't say much about the fact that a parent or someone we know is abusing diet pills or painkillers or antidepressants or any of the other different kinds of medications that are out there. Historically, we've made lots of pronouncements about our bodies being a temple, and therefore we shouldn't do this behavior or that behavior. And yet, we have not also spoken out and said, people who abuse their bodies in other ways. We're also a global church. And so we have policies that made sense to the 1950s Midwestern American values that were the roots, but are completely denying the reality of the cultures of other countries and the truths in which they've grown up. And so we need to come to deal with this question of what are the things that we need to give up? What are the things that we may need to let go? Do we need to think through all of the issues and ask how much of our truth is a byproduct of our past, as opposed to being something that is a principle that applies everywhere and to everyone? Those are all part of the struggles and the questions that I hope that we as individuals, as communities, and as congregations will struggle with as we look to moving forward, as we become intentional. As we go around this corner on this adventure, there are many things that we don't know. There are many things to be discovered. There are many things that will be surprising. But we do know that the mission in every expression of it, the mission of Jesus Christ, begins with simply sharing God's love and grace with all, one by one, with each person, with each who's in our community and in our relationship. As President Veazey shared, the church's future is related to our willingness to go where the Spirit is calling us to go. And so as we come to the end of this discussion, the end of our sessions, and as we begin to say, how do we take this knowledge? How do we move forward? We know that we have already begun our journey of transition as a church. We've already been given assets and resources and principles and initiatives and counsel and encouragement. And perhaps you could even say warning. It's clearly time for us to respond. But I believe that it's also important as we go forward from here that we trust that God goes with us every step of the way. And as President Veazey shared at his conference council, trust what is being born. I look forward to sharing the future with you, sharing the future in faith and in hope in the possibilities that are before us. So we had a question that came in the group chat that asks, you may have noticed in one of the slides that it referred to, we have 20 plus connection groups and 4 what it referred to as center places. And the question is, what makes a place considered a center place compared to a place where connections happen? I'll start by saying I'm not the expert on this. The idea of a center place is being developed. It's very much something that's happening in real time. It's constantly changing as we explore. But I believe that the idea of a center place is that it is a facility, a building, a place where we can gather, where it's designed explicitly to be a place where those connections can happen, where the purpose is to be the church, as opposed to being a place that simply speaks the church in the language that we have historically used. Again, I haven't personally been involved. I would suggest that this is something that we all can explore together, and I will certainly make sure that Carrie and Troy, in particular, as the ones who are involved with those organizations, find opportunity to express them more clearly, far better than I did, in terms of what the criteria are. But again, my interpretation is that they are places that take those connections, that express those connections, and are designed specifically around being that kind of new expression. That's, I know, an unsatisfying and vague definition, but I don't have anything much clearer that I can add right now, other than to say that that's a great potential opportunity as we look to the future.
If I could interject something there, Lou.
Sure.
I don't know all 4 center places, but I do know 3 of them. And in each of those cases, they have got a congregational base. For the church, there were either former branches or congregations. You know, so we got Toronto, we have Barrie, we have North Bay. Those are the 3 that I know. And so those center place locations are supported in part by those congregations or their funds. They also have a physical building,
right?
Which a lot of the other, what we call them, the other 20 community connections don't have a physical building. They meet in various host locations, such as coffee shops or a home or something else.
Right, and what's I like the idea, or I like the fact that you've highlighted that each of them has a congregation associated with them and supporting them. And whether that's part of the definition of them or whether that simply is how they have been developed so far, that's the part that I'm unclear on. And if anyone knows and can answer that, then by all means, please jump in.
Does anybody know what the 4th one is? Because I say I know Toronto, I know Barrie, I know North Bay, and I don't know what the fourth one is.
I think that's Brampton. That's and I don't know too much about Brampton at all, really, but I think that's Brampton is the fourth one. To me, I see these center places as places where we have much more than we have in our congregation. So right now, I mean, typically our congregations are about worship. You know, that's the whole meat and potatoes kind of thing, and most of our congregations, that's it. That's all there is. And I think in these congregations or these center places, rather, it's more about community things, you know, using the spiritual or in some of those activities, there's an overlap of the values of community of Christ as well. So like there's things like the meditation and there's yoga and there's the lectures and so on, but there's also things like just using the space for other faith groups, totally outside of community of Christ, using the faith, using the facility as well. And so connecting in that way. It's also about just those small connection groups using the space as well, like for TED Talks and coffee conversation or whatever as well happening in those spaces. So I think it's taking our kind of congregational activities and kind of throwing it wide open for lots of other things to come and use that space as well.